So to continue in our quest, moving into chapter 2, where we talk about subjectivism, relativism, and emotivism, what I would really like you to focus on is where you stand in relationship to those different perspectives. So objectivism is a claim that there are moral truths that are applicable in any scenario. Not to say that there are not exceptions at times, because if you hold that there are moral truths that apply to everyone universally, with no exceptions, then you are a moral absolutist. But an objectivist really just makes the claim that there are certain universal moral principles applicable to everyone, and does make some allowances for considerations of extenuating circumstances. If you are a relativist, it is exactly how it sounds, and that is you view moral beliefs as relative to something. If you're a cultural relativist, then you think in terms of moral truths holding for certain cultures, so that what works in the United States, for example, may not be what works in sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East, or what works in the Middle East may not be appropriate for Western Europe. What might be appropriate in a tribal community or rural community would not necessarily be appropriate in an urban community. What may hold for one group of people or nationality or religious group may not hold for others. If you are a subjectivist, then you really hold that we establish our own moral truths, that every individual is morally correct, and that moral facts or moral principles will vary from person to person, so that what I think is okay for me is not necessarily what you would think is okay for you. A lot of people tend to degrade moral disagreements to relativist positions, and it is true that the subjectivist position is really probably the hardest position to defend, because what you end up holding to, if you're consistent in that belief, is that everyone has their own truth, and that there is some tolerance required to respect those individual truths. The ringer, so to speak, that most people throw into such moral arguments is, of course, a Hitler, or Mao, or Pol Pot, or Stalin, take your pick. But if you are truly a subjectivist, if you hold to that position and are consistent in your position, then you would say that Hitler's moral truth is equivalent to my moral truth, or someone else's moral truth, that there's not a lot of variation, or can't be variation in levels of acceptance. This is not to say that a subjectivist position that excludes aberrant behavior like a Hitler or Pol Pot or Mao or Stalin don't exist. They do, and they are certainly much more defensible than a rigid subjectivist position. But still, even in everyday discourse, it's very hard to say that, I'm going to make a moral decision, arrive at a moral principle, and it's applicable only to me, and I'm going to interact in the world knowing that this truth is applicable only to me. Acknowledging that there will be other people that you will interact with that won't hold to that moral truth. If you're a cultural relativist, there are very difficult positions to defend, even if you allow for variations. So if you are a true cultural relativist, in which whatever is accepted by a culture as morally okay is indeed okay, and there's no judgment passed, simply the acceptance that it's okay for you, it may not be okay for me, or it's okay for your culture, it may not be okay in my culture, still allows for some pretty egregious acts to occur. And is there any sense of moral obligation, or any position in which we would want to say as a cultural relativist, well, certainly the act is not going to be okay. Genocide in some cultures is okay. Women throwing themselves on funeral pyres is okay. Female circumcision is okay. And if you are a cultural relativist, then you would allow those things to occur in the world. If you are not a cultural relativist, if you tend to a more objectivist position, then you're going to run the risk of imposing your moral standards or your culture's moral standards on other cultures. And that can also be tricky. So there's no easy solution. It's not as if you can just pick one of these perspectives, objectivist or relativist, and say that this is what I am. Most people end up finding that they are kind of a blend, that their moral principles that they follow are a little bit of both. And in some cases, it's okay to have a live and let live approach, and in some cases, we want to take a stand and say, no, this is absolutely positively morally wrong. We don't want this to occur anywhere, or we don't want this to happen to anybody. So as you read through this chapter, I really want you to kind of consider which of your principles do you hold from an objectivist perspective, and which do you hold from a subjectivist, relativist perspective. And then we can talk a little bit about emotivism too. For emotivism is the perspective that moral principles merely convey emotions or feelings, that they have no factual base. It's just a way of talking about things that we see in the world that are bad. So we could take the position, for example, that a child suffering is an objectivist, morally bad thing, that no child should suffer from hunger or disease in the world, period. We could take a cultural relativist perspective and say, well, there's certain principles that are upheld in a culture that lead to children suffering. For example, China's one-child policy for a long, long time meant that many girl children were killed or given away. We could say, no, that's absolutely not a good thing to have happen. Or we could say, well, it's okay in their culture, thank goodness, perhaps, that they don't do that in the United States. We could also think about it as simply a way of saying, well, that's just a very sad situation in which there's no meaning conveyed, a moral meaning. It simply is a conveyance of emotion or feeling. The way that we express our emotions about something, as opposed to being a logical, coherent argument that we would want to make. So just, again, think about your position, your moral principles, and how they are framed by these different perspectives. Which ones you would hold from an objectivist standpoint, perhaps even from an absolutist standpoint, which from a relativist standpoint, and maybe even some from an emotivist standpoint. Use the case studies in the text to kind of help you. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. As we move into chapter 3, we will really get into how to frame an argument. This is going to be a very important chapter. It's going to shape the rest of the work for the semester.